The moment Jonathan Pierce Harrington III walked into the Providence Municipal Court, the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't just the suit, though that was impossible to ignore. Italian-cut charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was the way he wore it, the way he moved, the absolute certainty in every step that announced to the world, "I don't belong here, and everyone in this room knows it." Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his case file, as the name was called. His eyes tracked the man approaching the defendant's podium, the polished shoes clicking against the floor, the gold cufflinks catching the fluorescent light, the Rolex submariner that probably cost as much as a family sedan. In 30 years on the bench, Judge Caprio had seen wealthy defendants before, but there was something different about this one, something that felt almost theatrical. Inspector Quinn cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrington, you're here on 12 parking violations, all in the vicinity of Harmony Hills Hospice Center on Blackstone Boulevard. Total fines, $2,400. Jonathan reached the podium and stood there as if he were posing for a magazine cover. He didn't grip the rail like most nervous defendants. He rested one manicured hand on it casually, the other adjusting a cufflink. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, his expression one of mild amusement, as if this whole proceeding was a quaint inconvenience, interrupting his otherwise important day. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying that characteristic warmth that had made him famous. "It says here you're an attorney. Is that right?" "Senior partner, actually." Jonathan's voice was smooth as aged whiskey. "Harrington, Morris & Cole, Boston. I handle corporate litigation. Fortune 500 companies mostly. I've been practicing for 27 years. He smiled, showing teeth that had clearly been professionally whitened. "I usually don't find myself on this side of the podium." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. There was something in his tone, not quite condescension, but close. The implication that this courtroom, this municipal court with its parking tickets and red light violations, was somehow beneath him. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. 27 years, that's impressive. So you know your way around a courtroom." "I'd like to think so, Your Honor." "Good. Then you also know that everyone who stands at that podium, CEOs, doctors, lawyers, or anyone else, stands as equals before this court." The words were gentle, but they landed like a quiet slap. Jonathan's smile flickered almost imperceptibly before returning to full wattage. "Of course, Your Honor. I meant no disrespect." "None taken." Judge Caprio looked back at the case file. 12 parking violations, all at the same hospice facility. That's a lot of tickets, Mr. Harrington. What happened here? Jonathan waved his hand dismissively, literally waved as if brushing away a fly. "A misunderstanding with their parking situation. Their lot fills up quickly, and I've had to park on the street several times. The meters are inconveniently short. 2 hours isn't enough time for your visits?" "Apparently not." Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly. "Are you visiting someone at the hospice, Mr. Harrington?" For just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people in the courtroom missed it, something passed across Jonathan's face. A shadow, a flicker of something that looked almost like pain, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that practiced smile. "That's a personal matter, Your Honor." "I understand, but this is a courtroom, and I'm trying to understand your circumstances. It might affect how I view these violations." Jonathan straightened his tie. "Look, Your Honor, I appreciate the thoroughness, but let's not waste each other's time." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced something that made several people in the gallery gasp quietly, a leather checkbook, embossed with gold initials. "The fines total $2,400, correct? I'm prepared to pay that right now. In fact," he clicked open an expensive pen and began writing. "Just tell me how much to write." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even Charlie the bailiff, who had seen everything in his decades of service, raised his eyebrows. Inspector Quinn stopped mid-keystroke. In the gallery, an elderly woman whispered something to her companion. A young man in the back actually laughed before catching himself. Judge Caprio didn't move. He sat perfectly still, looking at the checkbook, then at Jonathan's face, then back at the checkbook. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before, but somehow that softness was more powerful than any shout. "Mr. Harrington, put your checkbook away." "Excuse me. You heard me. Put it away." Judge Caprio's eyes never left the attorney's face. "This isn't a transaction. This is a court of law. And in my courtroom, we don't just write checks and walk away. We talk, we understand, we address what's really happening. He paused. So I'm going to ask you again, and I'd like a real answer this time. Who are you visiting at that hospice? Jonathan stood frozen, the pen still in his hand, the checkbook open. For the first time since he'd entered the courtroom, he looked uncertain. The armor of wealth and arrogance had developed a crack, and Judge Frank Caprio, with 30 years of experience reading people, had spotted exactly where to press. The silence stretched. Jonathan's pen hovered over the checkbook, but his hand had stopped moving. Something was happening behind those confident eyes, a calculation perhaps, or a struggle. The courtroom waited. Finally, Jonathan slowly closed the checkbook. He slipped it back into his pocket with movements that were no longer smooth. They were mechanical, like a man going through motions while his mind was somewhere else entirely. "My father," he said quietly. "I'm visiting my father." Judge Caprio nodded gently. "Your father is in hospice care? He's dying." The words came out flat, empty. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say he has weeks, maybe days." The energy in the courtroom shifted again. The elderly woman in the gallery pressed a tissue to her eyes. The young man who had laughed earlier looked down at his shoes, ashamed. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Judge Caprio said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "Losing a parent is one of the hardest things any of us will ever face." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Yes, well, it's complicated." "Complicated how?" Another pause. Jonathan looked around the courtroom, at the gallery watching him, at Charlie standing near the door, at Inspector Quinn waiting at his computer, at the cameras that recorded everything for the Caught in Providence show. For a man who spent his life performing in courtrooms, he suddenly seemed deeply uncomfortable being watched. "Your Honor, with respect, I don't see how my personal family dynamics are relevant to 12 parking tickets." "They might not be," Judge Caprio said, "but then again, they might be. Talk to me, Mr. Harrington. I've got all day. And I've found that the story behind the violation often matters more than the violation itself." Jonathan stared at the judge for a long moment. Then something shifted, the slightest softening of his posture, a slight drop of his shoulders. The armor wasn't gone, but it was loosening. "My father and I haven't spoken in 30 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. 30 years, Judge Caprio repeated softly. "That's a long time." "It is." Jonathan's voice was carefully controlled, but there were hairline cracks forming in its surface. "He disowned me when I was 22 years old, right after I graduated law school, right after I told him I was going to build my own career instead of joining his insurance business. He said I was an ungrateful disappointment. He said I was dead to him. He meant it." Judge Caprio removed his glasses, a habit he had when he wanted to see someone more clearly. "That must have been incredibly painful." "I survived." Jonathan's chin lifted, a reflexive gesture of pride. "I built my career without him, without his money, without his name, without his connections. Everything I have, I earned myself. Senior partner by 40, corner office in the financial district, clients who pay me $500 an hour to solve their problems." He gestured at his suit. "I'd say I did all right." "And your father? What did he think about your success?" The question landed like a punch. Jonathan's expression flickered. That shadow again, that glimpse of pain beneath the polish. "I don't know," he admitted. "I sent him letters in the beginning. For years, actually, telling him about my cases, my achievements, my life. He never responded, not once. I stopped writing when I turned 40. Figured if he didn't care after 18 years, he wasn't going to start." "But you're visiting him now," Judge Caprio said, "at the hospice. After 30 years of silence, you're there. Why?" Jonathan's hand went to his tie again, not to straighten it this time, but to grip it, as if holding on to something solid. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because he asked for me." The courtroom collectively held its breath. "The hospice called me 3 months ago. My father had listed me as his emergency contact. I didn't even know he had my number. They said he was dying and he was asking for me." Jonathan's laugh was hollow, brittle. "After 30 years of pretending I didn't exist, suddenly he needed me. Suddenly I was worth talking to. And you went." "I went."
Jonathan shook his head slowly. I don't even know why. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell. Part of me wanted to walk into that room and show him my Rolex and my Italian suit and say, look at me now. Look at what I became without you. But when I got there...
He stopped. His hand was trembling slightly where it gripped the podium rail. When I got there, he was so small. The man who terrified me my whole childhood, who I spent my whole adult life trying to prove myself to. He was just this shriveled old man in a hospital bed who couldn't even remember what day it was. And he looked at me and he said... Jonathan's voice cracked. Actually cracked, like ice splitting under pressure. He said, I knew you'd come. You were always the good one. Judge Caprio sat very still, watching the transformation happening before him. The arrogant attorney who had walked in with his checkbook and his condescension was dissolving layer by layer, revealing someone entirely different underneath. The good one, Judge Caprio repeated softly. He called you the good one. Jonathan nodded, not trusting his voice. A muscle in his jaw was working overtime, fighting to maintain control. Does that mean there were others? A brother, Jonathan's voice was rough. Tommy, he stayed, took over the business like Dad wanted, did everything right, played by all the rules, and Dad treated him like dirt, criticized everything he did. Nothing was ever good enough. Tommy drank himself into an early grave trying to earn an approval that was never going to come. He died 8 years ago. Liver failure. The courtroom had become a confessional. The cameras were still rolling, but everyone seemed to have forgotten they were there. This wasn't reality television anymore. This was something raw, something sacred. So you left, and he punished you for it, Judge Caprio said slowly, but you survived. Your brother stayed, and he was destroyed. I've spent 30 years hating my father, Jonathan said, and the worst part, I've spent 30 years becoming him. The admission seemed to shock even him. He looked down at his hands, the manicured nails, the expensive watch, the checkbook pocket in his jacket. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes, real tears, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since walking into the courtroom. I walked in here ready to buy my way out of 12 parking tickets. That's what my father would have done. Flash the money, waive the credentials, make the problem disappear. I billed $300,000 last year, and I thought that made me powerful. I thought that made me untouchable. He laughed bitterly. And then I sit in that hospice room, holding my dying father's hand, and I realize, what's the point? What's any of it for? I've got a penthouse that I sleep in alone. I've got 3 ex-wives who couldn't stand my workaholism. I've got partners who respect me but don't like me. I've got all this... He gestured at himself, at the suit, the watch, everything, and I've got nothing. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful and deeply compassionate. You know what I see, Mr. Harrington? I see a man who ran away from his father's world and accidentally recreated it. Jonathan flinched like he'd been slapped. I see a man who learned that love comes with conditions and success has to be proven. A man who built walls of money and achievement because he was terrified of being that 22-year-old kid again, being told he was dead to his own father. Mr. Harrington, you walked into this courtroom wearing about $20,000 worth of armor, and you know what I've learned in 30 years on this bench? The fancier the armor, the deeper the wounds underneath. Jonathan stood frozen, tears now streaming openly down his face. The mask was completely gone. The senior partner, the Fortune 500 litigator, the man who had never lost a case, he had disappeared. What was left was just a son, a scared, wounded son who had never stopped wanting his father's love, no matter how hard he had tried to pretend otherwise. I don't know how to forgive him, Jonathan whispered. He destroyed my brother. He tried to destroy me. He spent 30 years pretending I didn't exist, and now he's dying and he wants my forgiveness, and I don't know how to give it. Have you talked to him about this? Really talked? I can't. Every time I try, I just freeze. I sit there holding his hand, and there's so much I want to say, but the words won't come. And then the nurse comes in and says, visiting hours are over, and I realize I've been there for 4 hours and I haven't said anything that matters. He gestured helplessly. That's why I kept getting tickets. I'd park on the street thinking I'd just run in for an hour, and then hours would pass, and I'd walk out to find another orange envelope on my windshield. 12 times. 12 times I went in planning to finally say something, and 12 times I couldn't do it. Judge Caprio was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so gentle, it barely carried beyond the first few rows of the gallery. Mr. Harrington, can I tell you something? I've been a judge for 30 years, But before that, I was a son too. And I learned something that took me a long time to understand. Forgiveness isn't something we give to people because they deserve it. It's something we give ourselves because we need it. You're not forgiving your father for his sake. You're forgiving him so that you can finally put down that weight you've been carrying for 3 decades. Jonathan was openly weeping now. The $5,000 suit, the Rolex, the corner office, the 7-figure salary, none of it mattered. He was just a man, drowning in grief and regret, and Judge Caprio had thrown him a lifeline. Now, the courtroom had become something else entirely, not a place of judgment, but a place of healing. Every person in the gallery was crying. The elderly woman was clutching her companion's hand. The young man in the back had his head bowed. Even Charlie the bailiff, stoic after decades of service, was discreetly wiping his eyes. Inspector Quinn quietly passed a box of tissues to Jonathan, who took them with a murmured, "Thank you," 2 words that sounded completely different from anything he had said before. Humble, human. Judge Caprio waited patiently while Jonathan composed himself. When he spoke again, there was no trace of the officiousness of the court, only compassion. "Mr. Harrington, I want to tell you a story. When I was a young lawyer, long before I became a judge, my own father got sick. We didn't have the kind of complicated relationship you had, but we had our struggles. He was old-school Italian, tough, not big on emotions. I always wanted him to tell me he was proud of me, but he never really said it in words." Jonathan looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "When he was in the hospital at the end, I remember sitting there feeling like there was this wall between us, all these things I wanted to say, all these questions I wanted to ask, but I couldn't find the words. Just like you." Judge Caprio paused. "And then a nurse came in, a young woman, barely out of school, and she looked at the 2 of us sitting there in silence, and she said something I've never forgotten." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Sometimes the words don't matter. Sometimes just being here is the whole conversation.'" Jonathan closed his eyes. Fresh tears escaped from beneath his lids. "Mr. Harrington, you've gone to that hospice 12 times. 12 times you could have stayed away. 12 times you could have let anger and resentment win. But you didn't. You showed up. Again and again you showed up. And maybe you haven't found the right words yet, but you're there. Your father spent 30 years not seeing you, and now in his final days, you're the one by his bedside. Not because he deserves it, because you're strong enough to give it anyway." Jonathan shook his head. "I don't feel strong, I feel broken. That's what strength feels like sometimes. The armor makes us feel powerful, but real strength is being willing to take it off." A sound came from the gallery, a small sob quickly stifled. Someone in the back row was literally covering their mouth to keep from crying aloud. Judge Caprio reached into his desk and pulled out a small card. He looked at it for a moment, then held it up. "You know what this is? This is a card from a grief counselor I've worked with for years. She helps people process exactly what you're going through, the complicated feelings that come when you're losing someone who hurt you, someone you love and hate in equal measure." He set the card aside. "But before we get to that, I want to ask you something. When your father called you the good one, when he said he knew you'd come, what did that feel like?" Jonathan was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It felt like everything I'd worked for my entire life. It felt like every late night, every case I won, every achievement I collected. None of it mattered compared to those words. My father saw me. After 30 years, he finally saw me. And what do you want to say to him? If you could get past the fear, past the wall, past all those years of silence, what would you tell him?" Jonathan looked at Judge Caprio with the kind of raw vulnerability that his colleagues at Harrington, Morris & Cole would never have believed possible. "I would tell him that I spent my whole life trying to prove I was worth loving. I would tell him that I became successful because I thought if I achieved enough, he'd have to admit he was wrong about me. I would tell him that I'm sorry about Tommy, that I left and survived while my brother stayed and was destroyed, and I've carried that guilt every single day." He took a shaking breath. "And I would tell him that even after everything, even after 30 years of silence, even after you're dead to me, even after missing my wedding and my graduations and my whole life, I still love him. I've tried to stop. God knows I've tried, but I can't. He's my father, and I love him, and I'm terrified of watching him die without ever telling him that." Judge Caprio removed his glasses and wiped his own eyes. In 30 years on the bench, he had heard thousands of stories, but there were moments, rare, precious moments, when a case stopped being about violations and fines and became about something bigger. This was one of them. Mr. Harrington, I think you just found the words. Judge Caprio stood from his bench, something he rarely did during a hearing, and walked down the steps to stand at the same level as Jonathan. The move was unprecedented, and the gallery watched in hushed awe. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you now, Judge Caprio said, standing just a few feet from the once arrogant attorney. I see a man who walked into this courtroom wearing a mask of success. I see a man who thought money could solve every problem because money was something he could control, unlike love, unlike forgiveness, unlike all the messy, painful parts of being human. Jonathan nodded silently, no longer capable of speech. But I also see a man who showed up. 12 times you showed up for a father who didn't show up for you for 3 decades. That's not arrogance. That's not weakness. That's love. It's messy and complicated and it hurts like hell, but it's love. And you know what? That's worth more than any check you could write. Judge Caprio reached out and placed his hand on Jonathan's shoulder, a gesture of human connection that transcended all courtroom protocol. Here's what I'm going to do. Those 12 tickets, $2,400. I'm reducing the fine to $1 per violation. $12 total. Jonathan looked up, startled. Your Honor, it's not about the money. We've established that money isn't the issue here. The $12 is symbolic. $1 for each time you chose to show up when you didn't have to. $1 for each time you chose love over resentment. He returned to his bench but remained standing. But I'm going to attach a condition to this ruling, and I want you to listen very carefully. Before your father passes, whether that's days from now or weeks, I want you to tell him what you just told me, every word. Tell him you spent your life trying to prove you were worth loving. Tell him about the guilt you carry for Tommy. Tell him that you love him anyway, in spite of everything. Jonathan was openly weeping again, but there was something different in his expression now, something that looked almost like relief. You think you can do that? I don't know, Jonathan admitted, but I'm going to try. That's all any of us can do, Mr. Harrington. Try, show up, take off the armor and let ourselves be seen. Judge Caprio smiled, a warm, genuine smile. You're a smart man. You've won cases most lawyers wouldn't dream of taking on. But this case, the case of Jonathan versus his father's ghost, that one's the most important of your career. Win that one, and everything else falls into place. He picked up his gavel but didn't strike it yet. One more thing. That checkbook you were so eager to pull out, I have a suggestion for it. Harmony Hills Hospice has a fund for families who can't afford end-of-life care. Families who are watching their loved ones slip away while also worrying about bills. If you want to write a check, write one to them. Not because the court ordered you to, because your heart told you to. Jonathan nodded slowly. I'll do that. I'll match whatever the fund needs for the year. I had a feeling you might say that. Judge Caprio finally brought down the gavel, gently, almost ceremonially. $12. Case closed. And Mr. Harrington, go see your father. Today. Don't wait. Jonathan stood at the podium for a moment, looking at the judge with an expression that conveyed more gratitude than any words could capture. Then he did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the checkbook, and set it on Inspector Quinn's desk. For the fun, he said quietly. And Inspector, I'm sorry for how I walked in here today. I was every bad thing you probably thought I was. I hope this doesn't make up for it, but he stopped, unable to continue. Go, Inspector Quinn said, his own voice thick with emotion. Go see your dad. Jonathan nodded and walked toward the exit, but before he reached the door, he stopped and turned back one final time to face Judge Caprio. Your Honor, I've stood in courtrooms across this country. I've argued before state Supreme Courts and federal benches, but I've never, not once, met a judge like you. What you do here, what you did for me today, it's not justice, it's grace, and I'll never forget it. Judge Caprio smiled softly. Just pass it on, counselor. That's all I ask. Jonathan Pierce Harrington III walked out of Providence Municipal Court a different man than the one who had walked in. The Italian suit was the same. The Rolex still gleamed on his wrist. But the way he carried himself had changed completely. Shoulders softer, steps slower, the arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like peace. He drove directly to Harmony Hills Hospice. He didn't check his phone. He didn't review emails. He walked into his father's room, sat down in the chair beside the bed, and took the old man's hand in his own. And for the first time in 30 years, he found the words, "Dad, I need to tell you something. I need to." His father passed away 3 days later, but not before Jonathan told him everything. The ambition that was really a cry for attention, the guilt about Tommy, the love that had never died, no matter how hard he tried to kill it. And in the end, Jonathan's father said 3 words that the senior partner had waited 52 years to hear. The donation Jonathan made to Harmony Hills that afternoon was the largest in the hospice's history, but the check he wrote in the courtroom that morning was small potatoes compared to the debt he repaid in that hospital room, the debt of a son to his father, of forgiveness to resentment, of love to fear. Judge Caprio still keeps a letter Jonathan sent him framed in his chambers. It arrived 2 weeks after the hearing, written on plain paper instead of expensive letterhead. "You were right," the letter says. "The armor was the problem. Thank you for helping me take it off in time." Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy back the words you never said, the time you never spent, or the love you were too afraid to show. Those are things you have to earn, and the currency is courage.